Today, we're going to take a look at this, the WatchDives 1960S-1. One of the more interesting homage watches I've run across lately, because it's based on a pretty popular go anywhere, do anything watch that was discontinued a few years ago, the Tudor Prince. Now, we are going to get to all the details, but before I do that, I do need to ramble on a little bit about WatchDives and how I wound up doing this review, because I think it's important and relevant. But if you don't care about any of that, just hit the chapter mark specs down below and you'll skip ahead. So if you're still here, WatchDives is an online store that specializes in the same types of watches you'd find on AliExpress. So we're talking San Martin, Steel Dives, that kind of thing. But they're also independent of AliExpress, and also any potential baggage that comes along with AliExpress. Now, the thing is, I've been hearing about WatchDives for about the last year and a half, and I've been hearing about them from you guys, from comments as well as talking to some friends in the community. I don't know how it first got popular, but that's how I heard about them. And most of the comments are always the same, good prices and fast shipping. So when they reached out about a month ago and told me they had their own line of watches and wanted to know if I was interested in taking a look, I said, yeah, I'd love to. I've heard a lot of good things. So I went on their site, I looked at what watches they had to offer, and I picked the two that I thought were the most interesting. The first of which is this Glacier Willard Homage. It's a watch I'll get to soon, but the main reason I picked this is because I already have a Glacier Seiko, and I wanted to see how that dial compared to this. And this is the second watch, which I thought was maybe one of the more interesting ones they had, because there are a ton of Ranger homages out there, but not many of the Prince, which is a very similar go anywhere, do anything watch. But it's one that I always thought was maybe a little more alpinist or Seiko Sarb than explorer. And to me, that made it more interesting. So it's not a common homage, and on top of that, it's 36mm, really affordable at less than 80 bucks, and has that Seiko VH31 sweeping quartz movement, making it pretty affordable, but a bit of an odd combo in a great size. So I thought it was pretty interesting to check out, because these days I'm getting pretty bored of the same old subs and black bays when it comes to homages. And if I'm gonna look at an homage, I want it to be something a little bit more unusual and interesting. And one last thing here, in case you didn't already see the promotional tag, that's up because these watches were given to the channel and I don't have to return them. I know some of you care, some of you don't, but I always like to be transparent about this kind of stuff. That said, let's get to it. And let's start off with the specs. For this little homage, it's a slim, sleek 36mm case with a 44.25mm lug-to-lug. Some would say it's classically sized, but the main thing to note here is that with these specs, anyone should really be able to wear this thing, which you can see on my 7¼ inch wrist. A case like this is easy to wear and comfortable all day long. And in some ways, that as a whole is the watch's greatest strength, that it's very accessible. It's sleek, clean, and with that Seiko VH31 sort of sweeping movement, you don't really have to be a watch nerd to appreciate it. And that's something I've really discovered and kind of taken to heart in recent years. Some of you may remember the escapement time Flieger, and when they changed their Flieger to have this movement over an automatic Seiko. I did a whole video on it a while ago. At the time, I considered this to be a bit of a downgrade and bashed it. But the thing is, after I did that video, I gave the watch to a family member, one who isn't watch geek, and they absolutely love it. And for me, that really nailed home the idea that not everyone wants or needs an automatic, that all they really want is a good, well-made watch. So putting a movement like this in a well-made watch makes it more accessible. And before some of you comment on that sweeping part, this is technically, relatively speaking, a sweeping quartz movement. I mean, if you're comparing it to an automatic or a precisionist, yeah, it's not quite. But if you're comparing this to a regular quartz movement, it's definitely a step up. Not to mention, it eliminates the whole secondhand not lining up OCD issue. So I'm happy to see more and more brands use this VH31 movement. Now, beyond that, it's 12.5mm thick, so maybe a little chunky for quartz. But that is with the closed case back and the domed crystal. Lug width is 19mm, so all your spare 20mm straps won't quite fit. But the bracelet is mostly good, and it is easier to find 19mm straps these days online. It has a screwed down crown with 100 meters of water resistance, weighs in at a solid but not too heavy 105 grams on its bracelet, and at the time of writing this, price is $79. And that's cheap, but there's also the possibility of a sale shortly after I publish this, so double check that price. All in all, good stuff here, with one exception. And that's that domed crystal is a K1 mineral crystal. Or they list it as K1 hardlicks, but let's just say mineral. And for many, that mineral part is going to be a bit of a deal killer. Mineral is much easier to scratch than sapphire, and these days it's so easy to find watches with sapphire, even in this price range. So it is a negative, but I also don't think that they're completely out of line for using it. It's just that when you're making a watch at this price point, compromises have to be made, and especially when you want a domed crystal like this. And it is important to note here that in terms of compromises, I only found two things, two negatives, two nitpicks, with that crystal being the first one. And I'll save the other one for last. But otherwise, this watch is pretty solid and amazingly well built for the price. The brushed finishing of the case is nice, complete with narrow polished chamfers, just helping to highlight the sleek case shape. All topped off with a clean brushed bezel with its own narrow polished edge at the base. When it comes to the dial, it has this flat eggshell white finish with polished metallic indices. The indices aren't overly tall, but they do have some definition. And the design itself, this sort of inverse explorer, where it's still a combination of bars and Arabics, this is the design it kind of shares with the Seiko Alpinist. And there, as well as here, gives the watch a little bit more of a field or casual vibe than that of a pure dress watch. Further enforced by the detail painted chapter ring just beyond those indices, which comes across as organized and symmetrically pleasing to the eye, if that's such a thing. And I think more so here than the Alpinist, since there's no date or compass to clutter things up. In short, it's just a clean, versatile look. And I should also mention that the crown is a little small, but again, with quartz, you won't really be touching it that often. However, it is screwed down, and combine that with 100 meters of water resistance and this clean dial design, and this becomes an inexpensive, go anywhere, do anything kind of watch, making it a pretty cheap, versatile piece. One that's highly accessible for everyone, and that's really this watch's greatest strength. That's the story behind this one. Now, there is some lume here as well. And honestly, at first glance, with these thin pencil-shaped hands, I wasn't impressed. But there's a reason I test everything out and just don't eyeball it. And in my longevity tests, I was surprised to see it keep up with the Seiko Diver. So, while it's not overly bright, I can't complain too much. However, the bracelet, here I do have an issue. And this is that second compromise I talked about. Sorta. You see, for the price, as a whole, the bracelet is fairly impressive. Solid end links secured with pins, the clasp is milled, but it does have a pressed upper, as well as a number of micro adjusts. And with the female end links paired with an aggressive taper and short links, it's also pretty comfortable to wear. But where I had an issue with was the hinged area of the clasp, as it's kind of sloppy. I think that's the best way to describe it, that there's a lot of wiggle room in the rotation, where I'm guessing the hole that the spring bar is in is a lot bigger than that spring bar. But worse, the two pieces here weren't quite fit right, at least at first, because it did seem to get stuck and hard to rotate when it was fully extended, feeling kind of like metal rubbing on metal that it just didn't want to move, until you at least sort of shifted things around a bit and then it seemed to break free. But this fitment issue or sticking issue, whatever it is, it also caused an issue that you couldn't take the bracelet off. And I think it was because it wasn't letting the bracelet line up properly. So I'd push the buttons to take it off and it just wouldn't come apart. At least not until I shifted things around a bit to free it up. And again, that wasn't first, because after a day of wearing it and after a bit of just moving the pieces around by hand, I think I kind of broke it in, or wore it in. Because after that first day, it hasn't really been an issue. Now, I think at this price, and I think when you compare this to the other types of bracelets you usually see from watches at this price range, and especially from name brands like that recent Casio I got, I think there is an argument to be had here that it's still worth it. But still, it's not a great sign to see this at first, and something you should be aware of. Bottom line, there are two things really holding this one back from being, true diamond in the rough. First up, you got that K1 mineral crystal. And the second is the really sloppy clasp. If they were to improve these, maybe give it a little bit more lume, then I think this would be a no-brainer, even at a little bit more of a higher price. And personally, unless you are really set on a Prince Homage, I'd recommend spending a little bit more to find a watch that gives you those. It'll last longer and wear better. But as it is, there's still a lot of good here for the price. And that really is the thing to remember for the price. This is a value watch. There's going to be some compromises. You can't expect perfection at 70 bucks. Heck, when I started the channel, 60 to 70 bucks would get you a Vostok Amphibia or Seiko SNK. And this, while it has its own flaws, the build quality here is way better. So, like I said, it's a value watch. But as usual, let me know your thoughts on it down below, as well as your thoughts on WatchDives if you've ever made a purchase from them. I'd love to hear it. And as always, if you enjoyed the video, do something down below. Like, comment, subscribe, the routine. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time. I'll see you next time.